Hello, and thank you for joining the 5th live chat in our 2019 series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. My name is Jessica Soul, and I'm the Recruitment Director for the fellowships. I will be your moderator for today's chat. The 2019 live chat series is an opportunity for you, our audience, to ask fellows your questions. Today, I'm joined by 3 fellows, Genevieve Makar, Kim Binstead, and Theresa Parr, to share their experiences on what it's like to be a fellow. Before we dive into the conversation, I'd like to share a few important announcements and features of the fellowship. First, a recording of this live chat, as well as additional details about eligibility requirements, the application process, and program areas can be found on the fellowship website. The 2019 live chat series features one chat each month of the application season. Today's topic is the application and interview process. Next month's chat will be our final chat, and it will focus on asking a fellow anything. It'll be a great chance to join in if you're applying this year. We will send you a link to register for the final chat after today's webinar. And as I noted before, all chats are recorded and made available on our website for later viewing. Okay, so the application is now open and will close on Friday, November 1st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Feel free to watch the last 5 minutes of our May or June live chat recordings for a short walkthrough of the application portal itself to see what to expect from the application this year. And today we're curious, how did you hear about the fellowships? A poll will pop up on your screen and we'd love to hear from you. And excuse me, it's do you plan to apply to the fellowships? Just a few more seconds. All right, let's see who's in the audience. Fantastic. So we have a lot of folks who are planning to apply this year or who are going to be applying in the future. So we hope that wherever you are in your application process, that this is a valuable conversation for you and that we can answer your questions. So I'd like to hear even a little more about you now. So during the conversation today, which elements of the application and interview process are you hoping we focus on? You'll have a few options and you can select all that apply to you. Great, thank you for sharing all of your priorities for the conversation. Let's see, we have a lot of things to cover with everybody today. We'll talk about program areas, recommendation letters, your written candidate statements, and then also a bit about what the process is like after you click apply if you're invited to a virtual interview and asked to write a policy memo. So, as my final reminder before we get started with our panel, you must be a U.S. citizen to apply and hold a doctoral degree in a science or engineering field. You cannot be a full-time federal employee or full-time AAAS employee when you apply. And applicants with a master's in engineering plus 3 years of professional engineering experience are also eligible. Okay, so I'm very excited to hear from our guests today, Genevieve, Kim, and Theresa. You can submit questions via chat at any time by clicking the box in your menu and typing your questions there. And you can indicate which person or people your question is directed to. Okay, now let's do a proper introduction to the fellows joining us today. Dr. Genevieve Makar was a 2017 to 2019 Executive Branch Fellow at the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Mental Health. Her training is as a developmental cognitive neuroscientist. Before the fellowship, she studied the neurocognitive development of memory and decision-making from infancy to adolescence, where she could be found herding sleeping children into MRI scanners at 11 p.m. Dr. Kim Binstead was a AAAS Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow in the Office of Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Kim's background is in computer science. After completing her PhD, Kim conducted research at Sony's computer science laboratories on human-computer interfaces. In 2002, she joined the Information and Computer Sciences Department at the University of Hawaii, where she does research on AI, astrobiology, and long-duration human space exploration. She's joining us from Hawaii this morning, for which we are very grateful. And Dr. Theresa Parr is currently a second-year Executive Branch Fellow in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Office of Program and Strategic Planning. Dr. Parr is a clinical psychologist by training. In that capacity, she has worked in a variety of therapeutic, educational, medical, community, and research settings, serving as a therapist, consultant, program manager, researcher, and educator. Throughout her career, she's focused on how knowledge from behavior science can be adapted to inform programs and services in personal, community, and policy settings. Thank you all for joining us today. And as we all know, today's chat theme is the application and interview process. And the first question I would love to ask you is, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself when you were applying for the fellowship? Does anyone want to kick us off?
I'm happy to kick us off.
Please, that sounds great, Genevieve.
So I think, oh, can you hear me? Can I start? Yeah, I think one advice I'd probably go back is to think more broadly as to the scope of what science policy is. I think when I was applying, I kind of assumed that there would be a certain niche area for me based on my own research expertise and background and development and in child psychology. So I thought that what drove my placement would be my scientific background, and that ended up not being true at all. The opportunities were a lot broader. So the advice I would give myself is to really tap into what my skill set can do more broadly in a science policy realm, and where I could potentially see myself contributing in many different areas, and not just in a niche of child policy, which is what I assumed I would be doing. And it ended up being what I was doing, but there were so many different opportunities that I ended up interviewing with, and just completely blew me out of the water during interview week. So I think I would go back as I was preparing my application and think about where could I see myself going, the scope of this fellowship.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Another thing that I would suggest is, as a mid-career fellow, one of the things that was most challenging for me in the preparation process was putting my old life behind. So I came into this thinking that I might be able to continue to teach a course online, or other ways, sort of continue to do my old job while doing this one. Not a great idea. Not a great idea. So I do recommend to try and find as much as possible a way to, if you're only planning to come for a year or two, find a way to put your old job in a box and put it under the bed and leave it there to take out again when you get back.
I would echo all the things that have been said, and just add to it that if you have the opportunity or can network to find the opportunity to talk to somebody who was a previous fellow and get some thoughts about your application materials and how to approach it, I think that's a great idea. And if you can't find access to a previous AAAS fellow, maybe consider, if you know anybody in your network who has a policy background, and ask them to have a look and chat with you about how your background might fit in some of those settings. Just to echo something that was already said, which is that throughout the application process, I would have suggested that I think more broadly about what my skill set is, and not so much about my specific area of research or my specific area of expertise, but really how that might apply in a specific setting and be used in other capacities to address problems I couldn't even think of ahead of time. And I guess the other piece I would say is like, when you look at those job descriptions that get put out there after the application process, and you're thinking about different agencies, I would have said to myself, hey, think about those things more broadly. They're not quite what I thought they were at the time.
I appreciate you all sharing, and I wonder, that's a great transition to maybe ask about how you went about selecting the program areas to to which you applied, because we offer positions in executive branch agencies, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And how did you go about selecting where you applied and customized your applications?
Well, I applied to both executive and legislative, which I wasn't qualified for judicial. And in the end, I was offered both. I think that obviously you get a very different experience in the two sides, but also within each side. One of my concerns was working on the executive side is frankly political. I came into this because I was concerned about the state of the way science was informing policy or not informing policy, and I wanted to contribute to that. And I was concerned about which side I would be more effective on. In the end, though, after having talked to a lot of fellows over the 2-year experience, I really don't think the current political state makes that much difference in which side you go to and which one you end up contributing to. You can really put in your oar very effectively, I think, on both the executive and the legislative side.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, so I applied for this fellowship what administration will be working under, but I don't think the reason I applied at the time is I wanted to have a contribution where I could build something and build policy or build initiatives and contribute in a long-term way. And I kind of saw this as a way to think about how I can contribute to policy in the long term past this fellowship. And that's what kind of drove me to the executive branch to think about how I can help shape change. And I agree with Kim. Hasn't really, the changes in the political spectrum has not to the most part affected, but I feel like I'm contributing to something really important that can have long-term change no matter what's happening outside in the more political sides of things. So that's what drove me towards the executive branch, is that long-term impact that I want to have.
I was thinking about it in terms of what areas where I thought that my expertise might be useful, as well as what I wanted to learn. I would say, if I could go back to my previous self, I would say look at it in terms of what I need to learn, because no matter where you are, you'll be able to contribute, unless you have a very narrow niche of things that you want to focus on. So I know some people who wanted to focus on a specific kind of technology development or a specific issue like climate change or something. Well, that would help you, have an idea of where you might want to go, because in some places you couldn't use certain things. I ended up in the programming office, which has been great because I'm learning all about things I didn't know, and that was part of what drove my ultimate choice, is looking at, because I'm learning about things like budget, which is like everything. If whatever, that's a side piece of advice. If you start to do the fellowship and you have a way of sort of tracking things through the budget process, I highly recommend that, because it's really useful to anything you might want to have an effect on, is knowing how the budget process works behind it.
I appreciate hearing all of those different perspectives around, no matter where you might go as a fellow, you're going to be able to contribute, you're going to be able to learn. And we have a question here about, outside of the lab and the classroom, what were some of the things about yourself, your experiences, your skills that you highlighted in your application that you think made a difference and helped you stand out?
So I guess I could start. I didn't have any policy background. One of the things I had been thinking about and preparing for this, and I've been thinking about for the last 2 years, is I wish I had maybe been involved in my postdoc association or grad student association. I wasn't really involved in anything like that. But what I did highlight in my application were things that I did extracurricularly. So I spent a lot of time outdoors. I backpack. I'm part of a lot of outdoor organizations that also deal with conservation. I also have done a lot of outdoor leadership. So I highlighted a lot of that. So just to kind of show that I am multifaceted and there are a lot of things that drive me. And there's a reason why I like being out in nature. I care about environmental policy. And that's the only kind of thing I kind of highlighted that was not my specific research background. But I think one of the things I tried to do was to show that there are lots of different parts of my life, in addition to what drives me in science, that kind of drive who I am as a person. I don't know if that made a difference, but that was where I kind of tried to focus, not so much my policy background, but instead my community engagement background.
Theresa, anything you'd like to add from your perspective?
It's hard to know what had a real impact, but I thought that some of the skills that I now think are useful that I happen to have highlighted might have been a part of that. So for example, I had a lot of experience consulting, which I think is really useful in the government setting, because you have to kind of join with people and find out what they know and not appear to be a know-it-all, but still find a way to get across your message. And I hope that that was useful in my application. It's certainly useful in my job.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I put in my application that did the trick. I certainly talked about the range of things that I have interest in. I think that I really emphasize that I've worked with several agencies. I've worked internationally. I've worked in industry and academia, and showing I think breadth as much as depth was helpful. I had only dipped my toe into policy, so I did emphasize what I had done, and who knows what helped. I can't hear Jessica.
I can't either.
I hope that our audience gets some inspiration from you all to see that you don't have to be a science policy expert to apply to this program. That in fact, this program is meant to be the deep dive opportunity for scientists, for engineers to come to Washington, D.C. and have this experience, just like you all have done. So our next question is about how you prepared for your interview. So you applied, you received notification that you were invited to interview. What was the first thing you did and how did you prepare?
Well, one thing I did is I reread my application. It had been a while and I wasn't sure what I had claimed. So that I did a bit of a deep dive into the current news, although I don't think that actually helped me in the interview, but I got to thinking about some current policy issues that were out there and how I felt about them and what I thought I could offer to them. In terms of practical preparation, I didn't sit at my breakfast bar with a fan behind me. I found a neutral conference room and dressed appropriately for that, unlike today. Those were the main things I think that I did to prepare. I got a good night's sleep the night before.
I did a lot of similar things as well. I definitely read up on a lot of the latest news and policies and how I wanted to talk about my own opinions about those. I think a lot of the interview questions ended up being really broad about the way I thought about things, policy related or not. And I practiced a little bit really thinking through some of the issues at the time that in the political environment that were being talked about, just so I could practice my way of speaking about things and being clear and concise in the best way I could. I had people listen to me. I definitely sat in front of the computer and looked at myself talking just to make sure I wasn't too close, too far away, and didn't make weird faces. So I practiced a little bit just looking at myself, which is a little bit weird, but I think it helped at the end maybe.
I didn't do much different than all those things, except with a background in behavior science. I did look at a few policy issues that were more related to other kinds of science, in case that's where their questions went.
Well, I hear some helpful tips and themes in terms of being prepared, practicing, using your support network as you prepare for those interviews. And that makes me think about all the work that goes into getting to that interview point. And that includes crafting your statements of interest as a candidate in the application. I wonder if you can recall, if you could share maybe how you approached those written statements and what you included. Kim, would you be able to kick us off?
Sorry, I did actually miss a little of that. Is this the statement of interest that went in with our application, or our response to the questions before the interviews?
That's a good question. Let's talk about the statements of interest that are in your application.
Yeah, for that, what can I say? I really just dove in and tried to be both broad and specific. So I tried to get away from my particular research area and talk about policy issues I was interested in as part of the bigger picture, but I also didn't want to just say, I want to save the environment, I want to make policy better informed. I tried to find specific issues that I felt I could contribute to that were current concerns. And Cosmo agrees.
Theresa, do you remember what you included in your candidate statement?
Again, because I was a behavior scientist looking at the questions, I wasn't 100% sure how to approach them because to me, they read like they were more geared toward other sciences. And so I was trying to think about how those things interacted when I wrote my statements. And so I did something similar where I tried to stay broad and then give some specific examples of how I felt my expertise applied to those.
I went slightly different. So I think Theresa and I have similar backgrounds in behavioral science and psychology. So I kind of picked areas of policy that I felt that I could speak to with my own subject matter expertise. And at the time, I was working on some projects on the neurocognitive development of academic achievement. So I talked a lot about that work that I was working on and how it might help shape certain education policies that had been talked about or enacted in the last couple of years, the kind of things that the new administration was talking about. And I used that as my background as a way to bridge to how it could potentially inform the current nature of education policy at that time. So I kind of kept a little bit more domain specific to my research background.
And do you remember, I know we encourage applicants when they apply to different program areas to customize their letters and their statements to those program areas. Do you recall doing that and what you might have highlighted, say, in the executive branch versus legislative applications?
Well, I certainly tried to follow that advice. I guess in the executive branch, I had picked some agencies and offices that I was targeting. And so in those, I focused on what I thought was relevant to those particular agencies. Now, I don't know if I was right, to be honest, but that was my approach. And then on the congressional side, I focused more on the issues that were current in Congress at the time. So I looked at ways that I thought that my expertise could tackle those.
I did the same thing. I kind of assumed that I would be the best placement for me would either be NIH or I actually thought Department of Education. So I kind of tailored a lot of what I wrote to the agencies where I felt that my expertise would be most relevant. And that's how I basically structured a lot of my application.
I cannot add anything else to what they said. That's pretty much what I did too. I mean, I did pour over the instructions and the kind of different sample things that were there and try to see how that applied to my expertise and my background.
It's good guidance, and we do, look for, speaking to that opportunity that you're applying to. And so I hope people take some of your advice. And then, there's a lot that you as the applicant get to control and write about yourself, your essays, your extracurriculars, your CV. But an important part of your application is also your references. Could you share how you went about deciding who your references were and maybe how you prepared them to write their letters supporting you?
Sure. I could speak to that a little bit. I thought carefully about who knew me and what kind of setting that most applied to possible work in the policy world, as well as somebody who I thought had the time or was otherwise invested in me as, you know, sort of like a mentor person or something to write a thorough letter. Go and ask the person who's too busy or who's already written 5 letters for you to go for something else. So I was thoughtful about all those things.
All my references were my advisors in graduate school and then my postdoc advisor. They knew me best as a scientist, but I spent a lot of time talking to them. Particularly, I was a postdoc back then, so I spent a lot of time talking to my postdoc advisor, but also my other referees about what drove me to apply for the fellowship, what I wanted out of it, and really what my career goals were. It's a little bit awkward talking to faculty advisors who are preparing you for the academic world to then say, hey, no, I'm going to go do this other thing. So I took the time to, my graduate advisors were not there, so I Skyped them, talked to them about this shift that I was thinking about, and I think that really helped a lot, just for them to understand where I was going and why, and I got great advice from them as well. So those conversations really helped me think about, okay, which one of my advisors really understand the path that I'm putting myself on right now and why I'm doing it. And I drove my choices that way through those conversations.
Yeah, to echo that, again, as a mid-career fellow, I think of the possible referees within the university, there was a certain amount of skepticism about why I would be doing this thing. And so I spent some time talking with them about my motivations and so on. So in the end, of the people within the university, I picked the folks who were most understanding of this urge to broaden out and to have an effect on policy. And then for outside the university, I picked people who had already touched policy in some ways. So they either worked with agencies or something that was a bit more policy facing, so that they were able to, one, understand my motivation, but two, emphasize the aspects of my experience that would be most useful.
Thank you all. And Kim, I wonder if you could share a bit more about how you navigated those conversations as you approached your application. It wasn't just your references, it was, I imagine, other supporters and buy-in before you move forward applying and taking this fellowship.
It was complicated. It was, so on the one hand, I suppose I can reveal this because it's after the fact. Some people needed to be reassured that I would return to the university, and some people needed to be reassured that I was considering doing something completely different for the rest of my life. Both things were true, by the way. So there was a bit of that. Persuading my university that this was a valuable step to take. One complication that I had was that I'm currently and was at the time as well, principal investigator on a federally funded grant, which means that there's conflicts of interest such that effectively I wasn't ethically permitted to work on areas directly related to my project. Which is difficult because those are also my areas of expertise, obviously. So I had to put a lot into place to make sure that I would be able to do meaningful work while also staying within those bounds. It just meant a lot of thinking things through in conversations.
I did also take some time to make sure that the people I talked to really knew what the fellowship was about and the kind of skills they would be looking for, and that I was asking the referees to speak to. Make it easy for them.
I think that's really good advice. It might be a unique sort of reference letter that they're writing for you for this fellowship opportunity, and so helping prepare them and understand, not just selecting the right person to write the letter, but helping guide them in that process is appreciated. Absolutely.
I would also argue, and I know that this strategy is maybe not always, is sometimes frowned on, but when I'm asked to write a reference, I do ask people to give me in point form the things that they would like me to touch on. I'm not getting them to write the letter for me, but just so that I am reminded of the things that are about them that are relevant to the position. And I did that as well for my referees, so that they remember that I'd had this experience and that experience, and that I had this skill set, and that they could, so that they knew to either touch on that or not in their letter.
I think that's a really nice point, that some people may know you from very different spaces and experiences, and to help them understand how together their letters are going to show you as a whole person in a way that you couldn't do alone, or one of them couldn't do alone. So bouncing around a bit, thinking back again to the interview process, that virtual interview process and the policy memo process, could you share about what your experiences were like when you knew you were going to get to have that interview, and when you got that request to write the policy memo?
So I would like to share, because it was probably one of the busiest weeks of my life. Unfortunately, I forgot how much time we got. It was a week or two, maybe less.
I believe it might be 10 days, but it is on our website.
Okay. That week anyway was, we were just launching a mission. And so I was going 24/7, and I wrote those memos. I couldn't have put more than an hour into each of them. I'm telling you this now because the fellowship is behind me. But I really didn't have any more time than that. So I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. I think you should take more time and consideration. The other part was picking topics. I found it was really challenging, because one of our instructions was not to pick topics that we had expertise in, if I recall. And on one of them, I think it was the executive side, I arguably had expertise in 3 of the topics, of course the ones I wanted to talk about, which obliged me to go for something that not only did I not have any knowledge of, but I also had very mixed feelings about. So it was a real challenge, I have to say, to come up with a one-page memo that had any weight to it. But you do your best, and actually I think the experience of writing that memo so quickly in an area that I didn't have much expertise on, in the end, was probably the part of the application process that related most closely to what I then spent a year doing, which was doing really fast turnaround on something I didn't know much about. So it was a good practice.
Genevieve, I see you nodding along. Would you share?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. So it was also a kind of busy time for me, but not because of work, but because I had a big family reunion. So I was flying to the middle of Texas, and luckily I had a friend who was somewhat nearby, so I had to drive like an hour out to her to do this interview. So there was a lot of just logistics. Can I make this happen? The writing process, I absolutely agree that it was a really great experience. I was extremely freaked out and scared at the beginning, but my process to working through it was just start writing. And I think I ended up with like 4.5 to 5 pages worth of material. And then I had something to work with. And then it was starting to tailor and cut. And the way I did it, even so, I tried to use my own background in some way to inform the questions that we were given. So I did pull a lot from like behavioral psychology, and it just happened to be potentially relevant to the question that we were asked. So I was able to pull a little bit from the work that I knew that might help explain this policy area in some way. And then once I brought it down to a page, and then I cut it even more and reorganized, and the way I did it was just put everything in bullets And that was really good training for, so I'm a program officer, and that's what I did my fellowship in. So I don't have really fast turnarounds at all, but I do have people who want to know the bottom line. And that, I think, really helped me start to think about, like, okay, how are people thinking about science? What is really the most important information they need to know? And I think that's really, I always think back to that, especially when I first started, as to how to structure what I tell my leadership about a particular grant or something. That's my process.
I can't add much to any of that. That's pretty much what I did also, is tried to, I mean, it really is good training for some of the stuff you have to do and the way you have to adjust how you think about things and how you communicate things to make it useful to other people, and like how to change your language and make sure there's no jargon in there, how to simplify it and make it sound as authoritative as it should, but still fit with this sort of scientific integrity sort of idea of like, okay, you know, this isn't something we know 100%. You know, the scientist in us, I think, always wants to have like the, whatever we write, we want to have the section at the bottom of the paper that says, and here's what's all wrong with it. And it's not always appropriate for a situation like that. And so you kind of get to wrestle with some of those issues ahead of time. I did also know somebody who had experience writing policy briefs. And so I had previously asked them, long before this came up, well, what are some of the differences between how you write for that and how you write in this setting? And the tips that they had given me at the time were very useful.
I think you shared some really good, great advice for the audience in terms of, for some context, Kim, what you shared, I hadn't thought of before, which is if you apply to 2 program areas, you may be invited to 2 virtual interviews and be asked to write 2 policy memos. So be prepared for that opportunity. And that in all those instances, that it's really a good practice experience for what it's like to be a fellow, no matter where you're placed, in terms of using some of these transferable skills you have as scientists to analyze, synthesize, communicate about information in perhaps a new way. I think the committees would be happy to hear that it was useful and not just an exercise and stress for you all. Okay, our next question is about, did you have somebody else look at your application before you submitted it? Was there an outside perspective, a reviewer, a copy editor who helped you before you hit submit?
I never turn in an application to anything without somebody else reading it. And I think that that's good advice, and just it all depends on how much time I have, who I get to read it. I mean, somebody needs to read it for punctuation and to make sure it makes sense to somebody who's not you. And then if you have somebody who's got specific expertise, like I knew a previous fellow, so I definitely asked them to read it and see if it made sense.
Yeah,
So,
I had multiple people. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to echo the same thing. I had multiple people read through it as well, and I had people who knew me, like my postdoc advisor read through a lot of things. My husband read through a bunch of drafts, but then I also had friends who didn't really know a lot about what I do as a scientist, but they can give me perspective on how I convey myself through written form. I had them read it as well. So I had multiple different levels of readers go through my application.
So I'll admit that I didn't really have anyone read my application, but I did, when it came to the policy briefs, I had long and torturous conversations about topic choice with people, and also with overall strategy with the memos. And then I did have a friend read them over for clarity and punctuation and things like that. Yeah.
So I hope our audience is hearing loud and clear. It is very okay to have somebody read your materials, review and support you, and to make that part of your process. So as you think about submitting before the deadline, working that into your timeline, it makes a lot of sense. I wonder if we could maybe circle back again to the references. I know we talked a bit about how you selected your references and prepared them. And Jenny, I think you explained your references were all from academia. And Kim or Theresa, did you have any non-academic references?
I have to be honest, I don't remember for sure who I asked in the end, because I had also applied for a couple of other fellowships at the same time. But I had somebody who's been a mentor for a long time, who started out as an academic mentor, but ended up being a professional mentor as well over the course of some time. So I had that person, and then I had definitely had somebody from my academic work as well, who knew me in a variety of settings, so she could speak more broadly to my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a combination of academic and non-references. I also can't remember exactly who I asked, but I'm pretty sure I included people from, I've worked with NASA for a long time, and I've also worked with the Canadian Space Agency. Now that I think of it, I definitely asked a person I worked with at the Canadian Space Agency to write a reference. And again, his focus is more on policy, so he was able to speak to those aspects of my experience.
Could you share a little bit about how you maybe balanced requesting references, especially as you said, you're applying to other things at the same time, and perhaps needed multiple letters from both?
I mean, it's just a matter, to me, it was just a matter of juggling all those things. You don't want to overburden one person, but if you have somebody who's answered for similar kinds of positions, like I applied for more than one policy fellowship, so I did ask that person to send a second one because I knew that it would be easy for her to edit. But I think it's, I don't know, good practice to juggle what you ask to different people in your network, so you don't try to sort of like overburden any one person, unless, I would say an exception might be if you're kind of newer out of graduate school, then your advisors are going to expect that that's what you need to do, and that's part of the bargain they made when they had you become their graduate student.
I think that's fair and good perspective. And I would say, even though our application deadline is November 1st, if you select a reference, they could submit their letter at any time. So it's not to say that they would submit it, September 20th, but that it's a possibility for them. So the sooner you reach out to folks and the more time you give them, the more they're able to kind of balance the different requests they might have from you or others to get something in on time. So I wonder if you all could reflect, and maybe Jenny, you start. What skills do you wish you had before becoming a fellow?
Yeah, I wish, I guess so I can speak to this from the perspective of being a program officer, like what I had to do as a fellow specifically, which I wish I had a little bit more experience interacting with different faculty in my department, but also at different parts of the university. And this goes back to something I said earlier, that I wish I had been a little bit more active in my graduate student or postdoc association. Right now, I work a lot with investigators, and I help make decisions about funding. But I think having been in academia for that long and having this experience as a student, it could have given me greater insight into how all of these different levels work together. So you're not just funding an investigator, you're funding an institution. So I think for me, just getting to know what kinds of things different faculty members had to do in running their lab, what kinds of considerations, how they work with different levels of the university politically, how the structure works, the processes. I wish I had a little bit more insight into that. I think right now I make a lot of decisions based on the science, and I can do that. I have the training for that. I think the skill set that I really wish I had was to deal with more of the different layers of the university to understand how they interact. So yeah, it's very specific to what I do in program, but that's a kind of skill I think I came in not really having too much insight into this job.
Theresa? Kim?
I would say maybe this is a little specific to what I wanted to learn, but over the course of my career, I had come to feel that understanding how the money flows back and forth to different places and how that's used as a part of making and implementing policy. I wish that I had taken the time to sort of follow a couple of things I was interested in the budget behind them and how that budgeting process went, both through an agency and like as it interacts with the legislative branch, whether that would have been by state level or federal level. It's a big learning curve if you're involved with budget and you haven't had any experience with it. So for me, that would have been really useful. I expect that would be pretty useful for anybody, but it is maybe a little specific. To kind of segue off that maybe will be more useful to people generally, a skill set that I feel that I did have, which is like sort of a consulting skill set, I found to be really useful. And if I didn't have experience with that, I definitely would have wanted to read about how to be a good consultant. That's because I think that's very useful here. And what I've seen with some of the other fellows and some of the struggles that they've had in a federal agency is kind of like not really knowing how to engage people and build like respect for your expertise, but also show that you respect theirs and you're not kind of just like plopping in the middle of what they've been doing and saying, ooh, I've got all the shiny answers and why have you been doing it the dumb way? Not that anybody would say that, but you don't want to come across that way either.
So I think my response is going to be quite different because of my experience on the legislative side. So in academia and research, most of the time when you talk to people about what they are trying to do, they're pretty straightforward about it. You know, this is my motivation, here's what I'm trying to find out, and here's what I'm trying to do to get it. And then you can argue about the details, but everyone's pretty straightforward. I found myself a lot of times on the legislative side halfway through a meeting and not knowing why anyone was doing anything that they were doing. The motivations were completely opaque to me, and I would often have to come out of it, and my mentor, who was fantastic, I would say, what just happened? And she would explain to me why everyone was doing the things that they were doing. I got better at that over the year. I kind of wish I'd had more experience in complicated negotiations before. I don't know how I would have got that experience, but some more of that kind of that skill set would have been helpful.
I think these all really valuable insights, and if any of you have specific resources you would like to share with anyone listening or after, feel free to send them my way and we can make sure we distribute them in terms of facilitation, negotiation, consulting, because I'm sure people would be happy to get their hands on those resources. And connected to that question, what was it like day to day for you in your fellowship? And what were you most prepared for? And what were you maybe less prepared for? Kim, do you want to kick us off here?
Well, it was pretty wild. I don't know if there really was a day to day. One of the things I hadn't realized is that Congress has seasons, and each season can be dramatically different. Appropriation season is very different from fly-in season, which is very different from when we're not in session, and so on. I mean, my first day of work was the big Kavanaugh hearing, and my boss was on the Judiciary Committee, so you know. There was drama. So day to day, so one of the things that was very strikingly different from academia is in academia, it's all about, it's not all about you, but it's very important to put your name on things. You're the author on the paper, you're the scientist doing the work. In Congress, you are anonymous, really. You become part, in my case, part of the senator's brain, hopefully a high functioning part, but nonetheless, none of the output of the office is yours in any sense. You hope you contribute to it, but so it's very, very different in that way. Another thing that's very different is that it is 9-to-5 job, or maybe an 8-to-6 job, with both the strengths and the weaknesses of that. There's you show up and you contribute, and then at the end of the day you go home, and that was a big difference from academia, and certainly being a PI, where it's kind of 24/7, but at a lower level of intensity, if that makes any sense. And then another piece is that you really are almost constantly talking with people. It is between meetings and hallway discussions and emails, it is constant communication. So although there are some things you do need to work on your own, you get very little time to do that. So you learn to be very, very quick at turning one-pagers, turning one-pagers around at a very high rate, which again is very different from academia, where it's these long, slow, deep dives. Yeah, I think those are the big ones. There were so many ways that life on the Hill was different from academic life, but I think those are the main ones.
Jenny, can you share next?
Sure. So as I've said, I was and now am full-time program officer. So maybe my experience is a little bit different from most of other fellows, and I kind of chose it very specifically because in the realm of what is science policy, I wanted to stay a little bit closer to the science than the policy side of it, and that's what really drove me to this kind of position, where I am every day, for the most part, thinking about the science and reviewing science based on its scientific merit. And the grants that come to me, I do have scientific background on, so I was able to pull that. So in terms of what prepared me was my scientific background, essentially, right? So I was able to talk to a lot of investigators, some of whom I already knew before I came here, and talk to them about their science and critique that science and generate new ideas, help them generate new ideas, so on and so forth. But what I was least prepared is so when you're critiquing scientific idea, there's nothing, or there shouldn't be anything subjective about it, right? But there's a lot that goes into what makes a grant fundable. And I think on the one side, learning about those other constraints that have nothing to do with science, that have to do with budget or have to do with balancing our portfolio. What does that mean to balance a portfolio? And part of that is having a vision for a whole scientific field for the next 10 years. So, my graduate training and as a postdoc, like you're very focused on a particular idea, but now I have to bring it up to the 30,000-foot level and think, I cover research and anxiety. Where does anxiety research need to be in 10 years? So that was a kind of challenge that I was not as prepared for, but it's been intellectually stimulating to kind of think about it much more broadly into where can I draw the lines and how are these external constraints going to influence in the long term what I am able to fund and what I'm not able to fund. Those things I was a little less prepared for, but yeah, it's been a really cool process. Like just understanding that there is a subjectivity to the kinds of scientific decisions you make, even though you're making scientific decisions every single day. That was more challenging, but where the process comes in, I guess.
It's interesting. I don't know how I would describe an average day. I would say my experience talking to other fellows is that everybody's experience is very different, and a lot more of it can be directed by you and the choices that you make and the conversations that you have than maybe you might expect. I would say that there were definitely a lot of days where I was sitting there with a problem on my desk and going, do I know anything at all that could get me started on this? Like, and then if I don't, who can I ask, or how else might I be able to get started? So for me, it was a big challenge to figure out ways of addressing problems like that, like, because there isn't somebody else. Like in my other life, if somebody, somehow magically something landed on my desk and said, want to do research like this, I would go, well, it doesn't fit with my, my goals for my research. So, no. But now stuff shows up on my desk and it's like, I don't know, and there's nobody else. And so you're like, okay, well, how can I know enough to be useful here? Or how can I bring together the right people to do that? So that's a pretty big difference. The other thing that I wasn't prepared for, maybe this is similar to Kim, is there is a lot of talking. And it's like, well, how do you get actual work done? I mean, that is part of the work. So, but you still need to do some things at your desk to, you know, make all those meetings and conversations go like they should. And so that figuring out a different way of working was a bit of a challenge, but also super interesting. And then not being, you know, I was, again, mid-career also, and so not super used to having like a whole day be about things that I really don't know anything about. So it's like exciting because it definitely is like drinking from a fire hose almost every day, but I like it that way. But that is still a challenge because at the end of like at 5 o'clock, you're lucky if you get to go home, and then you're kind of tired, not because you're like running around the block, but because your brain was working so hard. But that could also be, you know, partly my placement. I know people who work on concrete tasks that they're moving along every day and they're mostly sitting at their desk.
Yeah, and I can just to talk about my day-to-day because I think mine is more of that where I have very concrete tasks and it's basically 9 to 5, and at 5 I can go home, and if I didn't get to finish something, it can wait a day or maybe it can wait a week. So there isn't anything super rushed really, but then the downside of that is I found myself working on this concrete task, like each grant has a set of things I have to do for it, and I could spend all day just working on checklists and documentation and all those things. So what I learned to do over time was to figure out what are those projects for me to learn about that 30,000 foot level science, the future of the science, how can I contribute to the priorities of our institute with my own background, and how can I just get myself into these meetings and working groups where they talk about these high level initiatives and priorities. Who do I have to go talk to get my voice in there, and figuring out where my voice is actually appropriate. Sometimes it was not at all, even though I got myself there and I realized I don't know how I can contribute to this, but I'll stick around, and you know, even then, like I will find a way to say something. And I figured out within the first 6 months to a year that that's something I had to do, or else I would just be doing the same kind of work every single day, working on these grants and not really contributing in a more high level unless I put myself more out there. And that's something I really learned to do.
Thank you all for sharing. I've really enjoyed this conversation and hearing about how the experiences, you know, in a senator's office, at USAID, at the National Institutes of Health, the differences and some of the similarities in your experiences, and especially some of the shared experiences as you kind of approached applying and presenting yourself as an applicant in this whole process. And so I wonder, as maybe this could be a wrap-up question for the group, I'd love to hear what do you think is the last thing someone should do before they hit submit on their application? If one thing is too much, you can give me a list of things, but something you think they should absolutely do before they hit submit.
I can say something quick. I would say just go ahead. Just hit it. Like, you know, if there is one thing, I hope that would be already done, which is definitely, if you can, have somebody read it and look for errors. But if you can't, still just go ahead and hit it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, this application process kind of lets you talk about yourself, who you are. So just, you know, as long as you're sincere with the way you described yourself and why you're here and what you want to learn, I think, yeah, hit it. Let yourself be honest and create that narrative, and then hit the button. You're good.
I agree.
Well, thank you, Jenny, Theresa, Kim, for joining and sharing about your experiences. Just a reminder to everybody who's listening, the application is open through November 1st. You can visit the fellowship website for details on the application. And you can also find the recordings of our chats and register for the next chat in the series. Our final chat will be Ask a Fellow Anything, taking place on Tuesday, October 8th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope you can join us. And if we didn't get to answer your question today, if a question comes to mind after you sign off, please feel free to email the fellowships at AAAS.org email account, and we will get back to you. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.